Please turn with me to Exodus, the 12th chapter. Exodus, the 12th chapter, as we consider this morning the subject. So what do you see? So what do you see? What do you see? And you will probably, first of all, see that I'm not starting in 1 John. And hopefully we'll work our way there. We know that's the reading. Everybody's taking the time to, at least everybody who's gotten up is taking time to read from 1 John. So we're not going to ignore that. But we want to set a little bit of context today. Why is that? Because as John brought out in class this morning, even though this is a time of year we typically call Easter, that word really only appears maybe in some translations of the Bible. More often, this time of year, ironically enough, is played out from the very beginnings of Scripture in the Pentateuch, the law, where we're starting in Exodus, on through John's gospel, actually, leading into where we are right now in 1 John. And so that's why I want to set the context, because this time of year, if we look at it biblically, even though it's been, we heard this term before, used in pop culture, it's been replaced by Easter. The original concept of this time of year was Passover. And that's the chapter we're in Exodus 12. In Exodus 12, as we begin in verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." Notice this. In time right now, we measure our time no matter who you are, unless you are under the Chinese calendar or you're following the Hebrew calendar, which we're going to refer to here, because that's what this is referring to, in AD and BC. And AD literally means in the year of our Lord. And so what that means is whether or not you are atheist or agnostic, if you're doing business, when you go to work Monday morning, your calendar turns around the whole concept of Jesus' existence and when he lived as a person. And so that is not a matter up for historical dispute. It's a part of your reality today. Every time you use the date 2022 AD, we leave the AD off, but we forget that that literally means in the year of our Lord. So all of our modern history turns on that date. And that's when Exodus 12 turns around as well. Because he's saying this is going to reset history for you as a people. Don't miss that. Let's read that again. Chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." So as we look at this time of year, this is the first time where God said to his people, "I am going to reset time around this event." Going on, verse 3. "Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for the household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. So you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight." Understand, too, they had to live with it. One of the things I learned working on a farm is you don't want to get too close to your food. But this is an exception. He's literally telling you got to keep it in your house, you got to feed it, and the kids got to love it. Wow. That seems extra cruel, doesn't it? There's a point. As we keep reading, verse 7. "Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted in the fire with the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belts fastened, and your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord," he says. Verse 13, "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Understand this. It wasn't simply because they were the Hebrew people. It was because they did as God asked that they were delivered. Why? If they didn't have the blood over their doorpost, they were going to perish too. And so ultimately that's going to point forward to the significance of blood at the season of Passover, as John describes Jesus' execution. But one of the things to also notice is as death passed over the house of the Egyptians, because he saw them covered by household in that blood. Likewise, this wasn't just going to be a one-time event. This was going to be something that they were going to do as a perpetual sacrifice each year. But before that, notice something rare about this point in Israel's history in verse 28 of that same chapter. Then the people of Israel went and did so. As the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. That's a rarity. How'd they do with the manna? Well, they tried to keep some of it extra, right? And it rotted and spoiled as God promised, right? How'd they do with liking the manna? I got tired of it pretty quick, right? Right? We preached not too long ago about these 10 times it did not go so well when God specifically asked them to do something to find that they would actually either follow through or follow through without complaining about what God told them to do. But this is one of those moments in Israel's history where, much like Noah building the ark, the author takes pains to tell us Noah did all. This is one of the times where they did everything he asked them to do, and it worked out. And it wasn't just going to be that time. Understand, the institution of the Lord's Supper, the Passover, is going to come at the end of the chapter, verse 43, beginning and going down to verse 51, as it reads. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised them. No foreigner or hired servant may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside of the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All of the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. All of the people did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. As you turn with me to John chapter 18, we're going to see how this moves forward into the sacrifice of Christ. Not forgetting that part I emphasized by voice, didn't really preach on, a lamb without blemish. You've probably heard it before, but as we've gone through the Gospels and through the epistles, it stood out to me more this time than any other. That whole concept of in the epistles, it's not just Jesus emphasizing that he was a lamb without spiritual blemish. It is the epistle writers who transition that into, as our brother John mentioned this morning, something that we are to do as his people. It is a mark, not just our love is to be the sign. We said it before, probably this time last year when I talked about 1 John. We were there roughly this time last year. It's not coming to church that marks his people. It's not assembling together, observing certain holidays. They're supposed to know us by our love for one another. And another thing that they're supposed to notice us by in 1 John's gospel, as he builds on that foundation, okay, well, what does it really mean to love? He's going to say it's marked by obeying his commandments and also striving for a life that eventually is free of spot or blemish. Why? Because that's exactly who Christ was. In John 18, over and over again, John mentions this time of year and he marks its significance in Christ's sacrifice, beginning in verse 28 of chapter 18. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas, to the governor's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Isn't that ironic? They didn't want to be defiled by going around heathens, but they didn't mind being defiled by committing a murder. And that's the great irony that separates. One of the reasons why it's so important to ask yourself, okay, what are you seeing? One of the reasons why it's not just Marcus being mean and pointing fingers and saying it's not just coming to church that makes you a Christian. It's because what happens over time is our focus on Easter begins to replace our focus on Passover, not just as a concept, but in life. We can fall into the trap of wanting to be ceremonially clean, but conceptually defiled. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to keep first things first. See, Passover isn't just an interesting thing for me to talk about once a year, because as a people, as we talked about this morning in class, Easter means a little bit different, something different to us as people in the churches of Christ, as it does to folks in the world who don't take communion every first day of the week. But it doesn't mean we can't lose its significance as well. Why? Because it took a long time for me, even growing up, saying, okay, we take it on the first day of the week. When I started hearing the Passover, it's like, what's that? Why do I care? Until I read the Bible. And I remembered just what John said this morning. I know Easter real well, but the Bible don't. The Bible knows Passover. And that's what is happening right here. See, they knew the ceremonial parts of Passover real good, but they had forgotten the fundamentals of the law, love, and mercy, and truth. The whole way they get here is because, as we talked about, as John and the other writers are writing about, we talked about the end times prophecies, the one thing they're saying, you're hacked. If there's nothing else you get out of this, beyond all the debates about the millennium or whatever, if you love truth, you're going to be all right. And that is your guide. Like if we're out at night, guys love to camp. I love to camp too. I'm just getting older and yeah. But camping, when you're really camping, helps you appreciate the need for a light. Whether it's a lantern, just a torch, or a good flashlight. And that's a lot of what's going on right here. He's saying the flashlight out of this darkness is loving truth. And that's what they lost their love of. And that's why they could be ceremonially, no, governor, we respect you, but we can't go in your house because we got to eat Passover pretty soon. But could you hurry up and kill him for me? That's what happens when you lose a love of truth. And that's what guided them into that place of darkness as we keep moving on. It was time of Passover, and so that's what they didn't want to defile in verse 28. But we're going to skip around because in chapter 19, verse 14, he's going to remind us again, taking pains to say that now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said, and that's Pilate, said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to him, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And Brian brought out that irony not too long ago. Really? These are the folks, if absent Jesus' crucifixion and the fury of the moment, they hated the Romans. But now all of a sudden, that's one of the things when we get into 1 John, we talked about it this time last year. Hate blinds me. And I talked about, I'm so glad I didn't get up this time last year and talk about this is how you should love your brother. Now I confess, I hate people. I'm sorry, but it's true. And I'm trying, right? And it's me confessing that I hate folks that helps me move off of that path. Because the more I'm afraid to admit it, the more it just stays balled up in here, and I can't say anything about it. That's why our brother's confession is so important, right? And for me, it's an opportunity to tell a stupid preacher joke. But in reality, who can really cast the first stone? Because that's the first step to healing, right? And so that is what he's talking about here. See, what was going on here is they were so wrapped up in Easter, the appearance. We talk about the pageantry, that one of the reasons why in the churches of Christ has traditionally been emphasized, maybe let's not be so flashy. We got our own problems, but that's one of the things I think we try and I think we do get right. Why? Because if you're so focused on the exterior and the pageantry of the moment, you lose the fundamental integrity that he is trying to teach. And that's what's going on here. Why is it that Jesus played so well in the streets and in the, for lack of a better term, the hospitals? We name so many hospitals like Bethesda nowadays, right? Yeah, because it goes back to a story earlier in John where the man by the pool of Bethesda was waiting for that time of year, that rare moment when the angel would stir the waters and people could be healed. But he had trouble getting in first because people were so busy stepping over one another to get their own healing that they didn't want to care about the man who needed help. And that's the Israel that Jesus stepped into. And Jesus is the God who didn't overlook that man's needs. And one of the reasons why his example this time of year is so important to me is because one of the things I started to realize is, wait a minute, out of all the evidence we have of that, why there is a God, even people like talked about Einstein a lot. He didn't necessarily believe, even though he was Jewish, he didn't believe in the God of the Bible, but he knew somebody made this, just from a scientific perspective, right? Beyond the science, sometimes it just clicks in with me. When I'm out in that period of deprivation, when he says, when you fast, it'd be odd for me to walk into a bakery But like, I wonder if they're doing okay during COVID. If I'm in the extended fast, the first thing I'm thinking about is I want some cake. But that's exactly who Jesus was. 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, starving, and he was still able to keep it dialed in. And that's when it started to register to me. That's God. Because when I'm in deprivation, I'm not walking to the grocery store wondering how Safeway's doing. I'm wondering about what I can get that I can eat that'll agree with my body once I can actually eat food again. And that's when I started realizing that's the level of sacrifice that makes him God and makes him the example that I need, right? Because that's what we talked about why fasting is so important, is because it is in many ways a foundational element of other kinds of self-discipline. I talk about it all the time. Your old middle-aged single preacher, I respect him even more because Jesus was a middle-aged single preacher. And if he had a ministry where the first thing he was able to look at when he looked at a woman was, I wonder how she's doing. That's God. Because I know I have to focus my attention on prioritizing my needs behind the needs of people around me when I'm in a level of deprivation that's dragged on for years or weeks or months. The reason I know he is God is I read in these scriptures the way he was able to put people first, even when he was meeting or he didn't have his basic needs met. And that's when it became real to me beyond the science. And so that's what's going on right now at this time of Passover. They don't know who he is because they're so preoccupied with what they want. They can't understand a God who in his lowest moments still loves people and puts their needs first. God, I can't understand it either. But that's the target. And that's the thing that wasn't so much the thing that we talked about it before, distinguished the apostles from the Pharisees, because the apostles were doing it too. All the way up to the cross, they were like, I want to be first. So it wasn't like they were just better people. They were just submitting to have their wills broken and reshaped in the image of Christ. And that's why confession is so important, right? It's acknowledging. It's not me pretending like, as a single guy, I got it together all the time. I'm doing really good. You should be like me. No, I struggle. And that's why I can appreciate God the way I do when I finally get it. And so that's what I'm seeing here. Ultimately, turn forward for me. I'm sorry, in chapter 19. It's not the first time or the last time we're going to mention the day of preparation. Once again, as he's up on the cross in verse 31 of chapter 19. Since it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that day was a high day, really. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. You see it by now, right? It's not enough that they kill him. Hey, we gotta go get to dinner. Can you make them suffer a little more so I can eat good on time, right? And that's what's going on. It's not just that they were willing to commit a murder. They're willing to make these men suffer and die under the pain of broken bones. Brother, you can relate to it. Just so they can eat a little quicker. And that's what's happening. See, once we get our Easter focus in front of our Passover focus, we begin to put our mere conveniences before the actual suffering of others. And that is where they got it wrong. See, they had become so detached from the suffering of the people around them, the people abiding in illness by the pool of Bethesda, the people starving and suffering as outcasts, as lepers in the camp. All the people that Jesus saw and paid attention to in the midst of his deprivation, in the midst of their privilege, they lost touch with those people. And that's why they lost touch with Jesus. And that's what's going to carry us forward to 1 John. As we make one more stop before we get there, as it talks about Jesus' burial at the end of chapter 19. Verse 42. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Talking about the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea back in verse 38 of that passage. But if you'll turn with me now to 1 John. 1 John. How does this connect to Jesus, Marcus? How does this connect to Jesus as he's described in 1 John? Well, ultimately, we talked about this morning. Jesus is the measuring point for 1 John's measure. Okay, well, what does love actually look like? We said it before. Even the Bible says if all you do is love and talk, it grows stale. What does it actually look like to love someone? Well, let's skip forward to chapter 3, famous passage we did talk about this time last year. But John 3:16, as our brother mentioned. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. And that's another thing that's come up over and over again as we've gone through the epistles. This whole concept of let love be genuine, making sure that it's authentic and it's apparent that it's authentic. It has depth. This is like somebody talked about when I was looking, a missionary was encouraging me. A South African missionary was coming through. He had set up camp in Mozambique where I'd been, and that was a conversation piece for us, but he was doing a lot of work in Malawi. It was kind of the flip side. We decided to go to Malawi, kind of like Lot picking out the nicer land. It's like, oh, it's easier here. They got more churches. People are already converted. That's where we want to set up. He's like, no, you made a rookie mistake. And so as he was encouraging me in the midst of my struggles, he's like, Marcus, the problem here is the gospel is 1,000 miles wide and a single inch deep. So we set up camp in rocky, what looked like rocky soil or rougher ground because they were rebuilding from war. 20 years later, if you've ever been to a place that's ravaged by war, that's what's still going on right now in Ukraine. It's so tragic. My American perspective on war was different until I went to a country that had been ravaged by war. They're still trying to, people haven't been fighting for 20 years in Mozambique. They're starting to fight again now. The buildings were still burned out. I could walk for 20 minutes and not find a public restroom. Matter of fact, one of my great stories from Mozambique was having to walk back, not being, but this is the reality of the place. The infrastructure is so burned out. Even in Malawi, where it's really poor, I didn't realize, oh, you can actually find a restroom in a public facility. Because my first experience in Africa was in Mozambique, where no, I had to walk 20 minutes to get to a place. Walk 20 minutes, because you can't always expect a taxi to be available. As you can in most places in Africa, even though they're poor, they still have infrastructure. And so when a place is trying to recover from the pains of war, 20 years later, they're not the same people. You can see it in the eyes of the folks. Same ethnic people, both the Chewa people. One people have seen war. You look in their eyes, you can see 1,000-yard, what is it they call it, the 1,000-yard stare? They still got that look in their eyes 20 years later. Generations that haven't even lived through the war are still trying to struggle to recover. And you can see it in their eyes when you try to greet people. Ethnically the same people as the folks we met in Malawi. But the people, even in their poverty, they were able to find joy in their daily life that the Mozambicans had. It was a struggle just to say hello to a stranger, right? And so that's what happens when a country's trying to recover from war. And so he was saying that's where we set up shop, Marcus. Why? Because we know when we talk to somebody, they're actually genuinely interested. And so we can't fill a church with people who ain't interested and come just because it's the socially acceptable thing to do. We've talked about, right? Socially acceptable sense, right? And so that one difference, war helped make the love of those people on that rough side of the border where they're trying to rebuild their infrastructure, that love is genuine. And so when we got a Christian, we know we got somebody who's really willing to be there. Why? Because the culture says it's okay to be an atheist and not believe in God anymore. Not just because it was a communist government that they were trying to overthrow, because war on top of communism has added to that people's level of depression and dejection and sense of despair, wondering whether or not a God actually exists, and if he exists, is he even looking at me? As he said, we set up shop there because we knew when we had a person in the church, we could trust them. And so he said, even though the gospel there may be only a mile wide, it goes at least a mile deep. And he said, that's the difference between where you chose to set up, young brother, and where we set up. But he said, be encouraged, because we set up home base there and working on both sides for a reason. We understand the need in both places. And so that's what he's talking about. And that's what this is talking about. When John is saying, let love be genuine, he's talking about in verse 18 again, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. And that's a corollary to what we'll see back in, if I got it right, yeah, chapter 2. Chapter 2, once again, he uses that term, little children, over and over again in verse 28 of chapter 2. Now, little children, abide in him, so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not shrink from him in shame at his coming. Why would we shrink from him at his coming? I just saw a movie last night. I don't watch a lot of horror movies. But after I read this passage later on that we're going to see in John, where it says, perfect love casts out fear. I'm like, I need to work on that. Maybe I don't need to watch every horror movie, but I can watch this one maybe. And I was glad I did, because it had some occult overtones, but there was a larger message I needed to learn about fear in watching this woman overcome the loss of her husband. And the story about how she began to understand certain things that she didn't understand about him in marriage, and how his sacrifice was one that was, in some ways, even though there's some things she found out that she'd rather not have known, it was an effort to protect her and make sure that she could have a healthy life going forward. We were talking about movies not too long ago. I was talking about some of my favorite Charlie Chaplin movies. One of them was Limelight, because it was a movie about an older man and how he was at the end of his career. And so that as he saw someone who was suffering in depression at the beginning of their career, he sacrificed the end of his career so that they could have a platform to climb out of a depression that was leading them to want to die, so that they could realize the potential they still had left to live. And so his last few moments in the limelight, he sacrificed so someone who was potentially going to exhaust their talent in depression could see their potential and go on to stardom, which is what they eventually did. Another movie along that line, old movie, Casablanca. My dad always used to say, watch Casablanca, Mark, it's a pretty good movie. I was like, it's in black and white. But that doesn't mean it's a bad movie, because it's the same principle. It's about a man who loved a woman so much that when he saw her in a situation that she was passing through his life again, he was simply happy that he could help her live the life that he knew she had the potential to live. And when counseling, a young lady not too long ago asked, I moved out here from my boyfriend, he left me. I shouldn't say it in that voice. That's a very serious thing when you upend your life to move for somebody. I was like, ultimately, she was asking, what helps you get over heartbreak and stuff like that? I was like, it sounds cheesy, maybe easier for me to say because I'm old, but ultimately you gotta love a person so much that you want to see them happy, whether or not that is with you. Otherwise, it's not just chivalry, it's not just the stuff of movies, doesn't just make for a good plot line, it makes for healing in some occasions. Because that's essentially what Christ did. It wasn't so much that you could live a life under another God. No, he hates idolatry. At the very end of 1 John, he talks about verse 21 of chapter 5. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. But he came here living a life of sacrifice with that 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, still dialed into the needs of the God who sent him. And then walking around at Jerusalem where it says, oh, you want to follow me? Really? The foxes have holes. The birds have nests. I got nowhere to lay my head, bud. That's where you want to go? Okay, come on. And that was essentially when he was still in that level of deprivation where he didn't have a place to stay, he still was able to stay dialed into the needs of the people around him. And so when I listen to my dad say, watch Casablanca, Marcus is going to teach you some important life lessons, and I finally wake up and listen to Casablanca. When I look at Limelight and I see that level of sacrifice, then I'm starting to see, even in pop culture, we talk about so much of pop culture is destructive and toxic. There are still some lessons to be learned that look way close to what Passover actually means. If you take a second to dig beyond the flashy movies with all the great cinematography and the script that you're having to forgive because it really ain't all that good. There's some movies that don't look all that good, that have some storylines that can help you understand a little bit more what this time of year actually is. And those are those movies that emphasize sacrifice. And there's one more I saw a week ago. It's about a man who I'd seen, but I always attributed the health food craze to him, because in my years of knowing him, he was just pushing health foods. And I didn't know he was doing it as multi-level marketing. So I was, that's all I knew him for was multi-level marketing and health foods. But I know how he got there. His name was Dick Gregory. I didn't know that he was a comedian, because that part of his life had just been overshadowed in the fact that he had lost his fortune. And how did he lose his fortune? Well, he lost his fortune going down south during the days of segregation when people couldn't vote. And people weren't so much willing to sacrifice their careers. And so what he started doing was canceling tour dates to try to add a little bit of levity to a movement where people were being beaten and killed. And they figured if you can add a little bit of levity, because they saw the way he was able to build bridges between the two communities, meaning they saw that in one evening he was given the opportunity to take the stage when a convention of Southerners from, our brothers from Alabama were in town. And they were like, Mr. Gregory, you don't have to go on and take the stage tonight. We got a convention we weren't really expecting to be here. He's like, no, I'm going to take the stage. And what he did was he made those Southerners laugh in a way that didn't compromise the integrity of who he was, but helped them realize all the things they had in common. And so they realized that if Dick Gregory could do that in New York, maybe he could do that in Alabama. And so that's why they sent him to Alabama. But the more he had to work in Alabama, the less he could go on tour dates that could support his family. And this became a habit to the point where Dick Gregory, who was just like Dave Chappelle, $50 million, why'd you leave? Well, I don't know, but I left. Dick Gregory knew why he left. And eventually he couldn't support his family anymore. And so the man who was making $1 million on the days when comedians weren't making $1 million was now having to rely on friends to support his family. And so ultimately he lost it all. And what happened was he became bitter over time because the home that he was able to build out in a secluded place where he could raise his kids in peace after he finally reached the level of success, he paid off enough of that to where they could hold the house, but everything else was in jeopardy. And so as he started to see younger generations of people come forward in what they called the civil rights movement at that time, he grew bitter because he realized that they didn't understand the struggle that came with the beatings that he partook in. So he didn't just go tell jokes, he marched with folks. So he's had over 100 nights in jail. He had an arm that was almost broken by a bat during one of those riots. And so it wasn't just that he was going broke and not providing for, I think he had at least 5 kids at that time. He was spending nights in jail, suffering in cold jail under beatings. And so when the younger generation, who also started to know Dick Gregory more as a man who was pushing health foods, younger generation of comedians, they had Kevin Hart in the interview, they had Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle didn't do everybody's movie, but he interviewed for Dick Gregory. He's like, you don't know who this guy is. He was literally Richard Pryor before Richard Pryor was big. And y'all can't listen to Richard Pryor because his jokes are, yeah. But he was very famous. Before he was very famous, this was the guy, and I never knew it. Why? Because why did he start selling those health foods? That's the only way he could feed his family after they lost it all. And so the thing that I thought was pretty funny, oh, look, this is the health food guy, he's always on a rant. No, that was how he had to recover after he sacrificed everything for other people. And when those comedians, they said, when we met Dick Gregory, it would be hard to tell he was a comedian because he was always grumpy. He was always mad about something. But what this thing is going to say in 1 John chapter 2, as our brothers have said, love one another. This is the one thing, the reason I told that long protracted Dick Gregory story is I want you to understand this about love. Beginning in verse 11 of actually chapter 3. For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. That convicted me so much because I made that confession. I hate people. But at the same time, when I thought of Dick Gregory's story, I understood when I heard Kevin Hart and Dave Chappelle talk about what it was like to want to go meet their hero. They knew he was a comedian. They thought he was going to be a funny guy, but all they found was somebody who was just grumpy. They didn't describe him as a grumpy guy. They said we knew where his pain came from because even though we were rich and well off, we didn't make the sacrifices that he made. We didn't have to face the road of recovery that he had to face. And what happened was, all Dick Gregory had to do to get his smile back was go back to the very beginning. And they said the great victory in Dick Gregory's story is he started to do stand-up comedy again toward the end of his life. And even though he was starting to sink down into the depths of dementia, that talent that God had woven into his foundation was deeper than his memory loss. And he became a funny man again. All of the pain that he endured during the beatings and the nights in jail and the poverty that his family endured when they should have been sitting in a mansion, he was able to laugh about it again. Because the thing that gave Dick Gregory the ability to join two crowds together was not his ability to appease one group and tell all the jokes they liked and appease another group by telling all the jokes they liked, but he was able to find common truths that everybody had in common that everybody could laugh at. And that is what allowed him to be successful in the first place. And at the end of his life, the thing that allowed him to overcome his bitterness was his ability to joke about the mistakes he made trying to get all the money back again and legitimately make fun of all the turns he made this way or that way when he should have just been going straight. And once he lost the focus on trying to get the money back and rediscovered why God had put him here in the first place, then he was able to rediscover his love for people. And it wasn't just Dick Gregory who rediscovered his love for people. It was people like Dave Chappelle and Kevin Hart who were able to understand him in his perspective, his struggle, and why he was so mean to them when they were hoping he would have been a nice guy. And what's the lesson for us? Jesus, when he's saying love one another, love isn't always about niceness. Niceness is an important factor of love because one of the basic Greek words for love, we call it storge, is affection. So we're supposed to be affectionate toward one another. But there are times when we're going to have to understand why one another are simply grumpy. And the way do we get, like we talked about it before, to a deeper love is understanding the deeper root causes for the things that are going on in each one of us emotionally. And that takes time. It's going to take time for you to bear with me, even though I'm happy all the time. And it's those things that help love's genuineness really prove itself over time. And so even though love is a nice feeling to have at the moment, once you get to maturity, I remember I'm going to give you a story about an elder to close out. Elder I look up to quite a bit to this day, even though he might not know. He'd be like, what if I put his name out there? He'd be like, you talking about me? It's because I lived in his house for a while as I was interning, and then went back again to help a youth group try to grow. And the thing I loved about it is he had an amazing sense of humor. But much like Dick Gregory, I'd seen the stress on him as an elder as he tried to help grow a church in an age where the New Christian Chronicle is out now. If you look at it on the back table, it talks about a church down south that's closing its doors. It says that's basically a trend now. A lot of churches after the pandemic are just flat out shutting down. And so I saw him in that struggle as he was trying to help a church grow. And he was struggling with the frustration of not having what he considered to be a lot of help at a time when he saw things that were a lot different than the way they were when he first started as an elder. And I saw it start to wear on him over time. And this man who had a natural sense of humor, much like Dick Gregory, over time, I began to see his frustrations. But I knew that's not who he was as a person. See, the frustrations were just a source of him mourning the loss of what the congregation had once had. See, but if all I did was focus on what was going on, the difference between when I'd seen him at first and the fact that he wasn't telling as many jokes when I seen him a few years later, then I would have missed the point and I wouldn't have really been loving the man who had shown me so much love and guidance as I needed it early on in my ministry. See, I had to understand what was the reason why this man could not muster the same kind of affection he used to be able to muster before. It's because, on the other hand, he had so much love for the churches of Christ that he hated to see what was happening to them. And so it wasn't just a bitterness that was born out of self-interest. He had a frustration that was born out of his love for other people. And some people call it righteous indignation. And so when we're talking about Passover this time of year, there are times when Christ gets angry and what he's going to say over and over again. The key to Dave Chappelle and Kevin Hart understanding Dick Gregory's frustration, the key to me understanding my elder's frustration in that situation was abiding in Christ. And that's another concept in your own time of personal study, maybe just word study, abide. And why it comes up so much, not only in John's gospel, but here again in his epistle. One of the instances, he'll simply say, as we already read in verse 28 of chapter 2, and now little children, abide in him, so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not shrink from shame at his coming. Why would we shrink from shame? Going back to that question, it's because we've lost interest in the things that interest Christ. And one of the reasons why it's so important to understand Passover is because it helps us as we go past what we've been sold as what this time of year is about, and we dig deeper. Like you said, it's a beautiful time of year to celebrate with family. I celebrate Easter every year. I love Easter egg hunts when I was a kid. I still love them. We plan them. I was in the grocery store this weekend talking to some folks, struck up a conversation. Why? Because they were buying Easter eggs for their folks. They were having an Easter egg hunt for their kids. I was like, what church do y'all go to? They're like, oh, this isn't for the church one. This is the one we're having at the house afterward. You think I got there and preached them a sermon about how Passover is really what? No. I was like, have a happy Easter. And I hope the kids enjoy it too, right? Because this is a catalyst for us to refocus our attention and simply go another inch deeper into our understanding of who Jesus is. So this is not to deride using the time of Easter as a time of celebration. It's using it as a time to go deeper in our love and understanding of who Jesus is. Why? Because ultimately the thing that will give us confidence in the day of judgment is beginning to get so closely aligned with his interests that they say, like over time in a marriage, sometimes you get to a point, of course I have to only say by anecdote, you can complete the other one's sentences in ways that other folks just can't, right? There are nonverbal ways of communication that over time you just pick up in ways that other folks can't. Why? Because merely by living closely with another person, you begin to pick up on their traits, their interests, their likes, their wants, and their needs. And that is what he's talking about here. That's what gives us confidence for the day of judgment. Understanding the mentality of one around whom all time shifted twice. Once at the Passover in Exodus, and later on in John, as we read in John's gospel, where he emphasizes 4 times Jesus died during the season of Passover. And once again, whereas it was once for a tiny nation over in the Middle East, their calendar shifted. Now all mankind's calendar has shifted around the life and death of this Christ. And what he's saying is when he comes back, you won't have to shrink at his appearance. If, like you devoted to trying to grow your marriage, you're devoted to trying to grow our marriage to Christ, because we're described as the bride of Christ. And so he's helping us understand how devoted we need to be. Not necessarily because he needs us. He's going to be fine when he comes back. Like, I'm good, right? But he's writing this, why? Because he wants us to have confidence too. And our confidence comes in familiarity. And so this is what I will say as we close. Brother John, I'll close with a statement you made. This is really a time of sacrifice, right? And so this is a time to understand that, much like Brother John said in class and Ms. Laura emphasized, I said I was going to try to make it, never know what's going to happen when I get up here and start talking. But that whole point you made in class about sacrifice, we talked about what does Easter mean to you? And she said that for her, it's going in to help people at her job make sure that they can get things done. And so it wasn't so much the celebration as much as it was sacrificing her personal time to help other people out. That's a mentality that can help us in our daily lives, because that's exactly what he was doing here. Once again, we talked about the Great Commission. It wasn't some Great Commission like, I want you to go to this place. No, it literally says in the Greek, as you are going. And Mark is going to add an ad-lib about your daily life. Look for ways in which you can see the needs of other people and make sure that their load is a little bit lighter. And with that, I just bought a whole bunch of stuff because we get a lot of calls for folks who don't have food, right? And they're periodic calls. But I finally got the gumption. I was like, God, I don't want to go tomorrow. It's Saturday. Or today's Saturday. So I went on Saturday, went out, buying some stuff for me, and I bought a bunch of canned goods too. I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to start putting boxes together. If anybody wants to join me, you don't have to take all your time. You don't have to stay at all. Miss Laura has an excuse because she's going to work. But if you want to put a few canned goods together, this is an experiment. I haven't put boxes together like this in a while. I'm just going to get it started. Don't know how to go. But that was one thing that after I stopped saying no to the Spirit yesterday, it might not have been the Spirit. It might have just been Marcus talking to himself. But I bought some stuff. If you want to help stuff boxes for those folks who occasionally call the building in need of stuff, that's what I'm going to try to do, to go at least another foot or two deeper into what Passover, I think, is supposed to mean to us, and try to live out my thanks to God. Thank you all for being patient.